63% of the people who will start listening to this audiobook will not finish it. Not because the content is wrong, but because their minds will convince them they already know what comes next. That this is just another book telling them to breathe deeper, think positive, and try harder. This is not that book. And if you are still here in the next 3 minutes, you will understand why everything you have tried until now has failed. Not because you did it wrong, but because you were solving the wrong problem entirely. Here is something no one has told you. Your anxiety is not a bug. It is a feature. A feature of a system so sophisticated, so finely tuned, so desperate to protect you that it is willing to destroy your peace of mind to keep you safe from dangers that no longer exist. You are not broken. You are running. And you have been running so long that you forgot there was ever a time before the exhaustion, before the noise, before the voice in your head that never stops analyzing, questioning, warning you about everything that could go wrong. I need you to stop for a moment, just for this moment, because what I am about to tell you is going to feel like cold water after years of fever. The problem was never you. The problem was the map you were given. Every self-improvement book you read, every productivity system you implemented, every morning routine you forced yourself through, every meditation app you downloaded and abandoned, every time you told yourself to just be more disciplined, more positive, more grateful. All of it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how your mind actually works. And that misunderstanding cost you years. I know this because I have studied the research that most self-help authors ignore. Research that reveals something uncomfortable, something the wellness industry would rather you did not know. Because if you understood what I am about to share, you would stop buying their solutions to problems they need you to keep having. Let me tell you about a study that should have changed everything. Researchers at the University of California, Berkeley tracked 847 high-achieving professionals over 7 years. These were not average performers. These were people at the top of their fields. Executives, surgeons, attorneys, engineers, people whose external success was undeniable. The researchers wanted to answer a simple question. What separates the high performers who thrive from the high performers who burn out? The obvious answer would be work-life balance, or stress management techniques. Or maybe some people are just built for pressure and others are not. None of those were the answer. The single variable that predicted burnout with 91% accuracy had nothing to do with workload, personality type, or coping strategies. It was this: how the person's nervous system had learned to interpret effort. The high performers who burned out had nervous systems that treated every task as a threat to be survived. Their bodies could not tell the difference between a challenging project and a charging predator. Both triggered the same ancient alarm system. Both flooded them with the same stress hormones. Both left them depleted in exactly the same way. The high performers who thrived had nervous systems that treated challenges as opportunities to engage. Same external pressure, same demanding environments, completely different internal experience. And here's the part that matters most. The difference was not genetic. It was not permanent. It was learned, which means it can be unlearned, which means everything you are experiencing right now, the exhaustion, the racing thoughts, the anxiety that logic cannot touch, all of it can change. Not through more effort, through understanding. But first, you need to see clearly what you have been up against. Let me describe your experience back to you, not to impress you with what I know, but because being seen accurately is the first step toward change. And you have not been seen accurately, not by the books that told you to fix your mindset, not by the people who told you to just relax, not by anyone who has ever made you feel like your struggle was a personal failure rather than a predictable response to an impossible situation. You wake up tired, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, a deeper tired, like something has been running in the background all night, consuming energy even while you are unconscious. You go through your day performing, meeting expectations, hitting targets, saying the right things in meetings. And somewhere underneath the performance, there is a hum, a low-grade static of worry that never fully resolves. It does not always have a specific object. Sometimes you are anxious about work, sometimes about relationships, sometimes about nothing you can name. The content changes. The feeling persists. You have good days, days where the noise quiets and you remember what it feels like to be at peace. And then something happens. an email, a comment, a moment of uncertainty, and the whole system spins up again. Back to scanning for threats, back to analyzing what might go wrong, back to the exhausting vigilance that you cannot seem to turn off. You have tried to fix this. God knows you have tried. You have read about cognitive restructuring and positive affirmations and gratitude practices. Maybe they helped briefly, a day, a week. Then the old patterns reasserted themselves, and you were left wondering what you did wrong this time. Here is what you did wrong. Nothing. You were using the wrong tools for the wrong problem. And I can prove it to you with one question. Have you ever had the experience of knowing, logically and intellectually, that your anxiety is irrational while still feeling completely controlled by it? Of course you have. Every intelligent person with anxiety has had this experience. You can see clearly that the fear is disproportionate to the actual threat. You can list all the reasons why worrying will not help. You can understand perfectly that your thoughts are distorted. And none of that understanding makes the slightest difference to how you feel. This is not a failure of your reasoning. It is evidence that reasoning is the wrong tool. Your anxiety does not live in your thoughts. It lives in your nervous system. And your nervous system does not take instructions from your logic any more than your heartbeat takes instructions from your opinions about cardiac rhythm. This is the insight that changes everything. And it is backed by decades of neuroscience that somehow never made it into the self-help mainstream. Dr. Stephen Porges at Indiana University developed what he called polyvagal theory after 30 years of research into the autonomic nervous system. His findings fundamentally rewrote our understanding of how humans experience safety and threat. Here is the short version. Your nervous system has 3 distinct operating modes, not 2, as previously believed. 3. And these modes determine not just how you feel, but how you perceive reality itself. When your nervous system is in the first mode, the safety mode, you have access to your full capabilities. You can think creatively. You can connect authentically. You can handle complexity without overwhelm. Your face is expressive. Your voice has natural melody. Your body is relaxed but alert. This is where your best work happens, where your real personality lives, where life actually feels worth living. When your nervous system shifts into the second mode, the danger mode, everything changes. Your thinking narrows to threat detection. Your creativity disappears. Your ability to connect diminishes. Your face becomes tense. Your voice flattens. Your body prepares to fight or run. This is not a choice. This is biology. Your brain is literally receiving less blood flow to the regions responsible for complex thought. You are operating with reduced cognitive capacity, whether you realize it or not. When your nervous system shifts into the third mode, the shutdown mode, you disconnect entirely. You feel numb, foggy, unable to engage. This is the collapse response, the last resort when neither fighting nor fleeing is possible. Most people with chronic anxiety are bouncing between the second and third modes, rarely touching the first. And here is the cruelty of it. They keep trying to solve their problems using tools that only work in the first mode. Positive thinking requires cognitive flexibility, which is reduced in threat mode. Complex problem solving requires prefrontal cortex engagement, which is diminished in threat mode. Self-compassion requires social engagement circuitry, which goes offline in threat mode. You have been trying to use software that your operating system does not currently support, and every failure has convinced you that something is wrong with you, rather than something is wrong with the approach. Now let me tell you what is actually wrong with the approach. The self-improvement industry is built on a cognitive model. The assumption is that if you change your thoughts, your feelings will follow. Think positive, feel positive. Reframe the negative, experience less negativity. This model is not completely wrong. It just has the causation backwards. Your thoughts do not create your nervous system state. Your nervous system state creates your thoughts. When your body is in threat mode, your brain generates threat-focused thoughts. That is its job. It is trying to identify the danger so you can escape it. Telling it to think positive is like telling a smoke detector to stop beeping while the house is on fire. You are addressing the signal while ignoring the source. This is why positive affirmations feel hollow when you are anxious. Your nervous system knows you are in danger. You telling yourself everything is fine just creates a conflict between what you are saying and what you are experiencing. That conflict is itself threatening. Your system escalates. This is why thought suppression backfires. When you try not to think about something, you have to monitor constantly to catch the forbidden thought. That monitoring signals vigilance. Vigilance signals threat. Your nervous system responds to your attempt at control as evidence that danger is present. This is why discipline eventually fails. Willpower is a prefrontal cortex function. It runs on the same limited resources as emotional regulation. Every time you force yourself to push through anxiety, you deplete the very capacity you need to regulate the anxiety. You are fighting a war with your own supply lines. You have not been failing at self-improvement. Self-improvement has been failing you. And it has been failing you because it does not understand what you actually are. Not a mind that has a body that generates a mind. Not a rational agent occasionally disrupted by irrational emotions. An organism whose rationality emerges from and depends upon emotional and physiological foundations. The paradigm shift I am offering you is simple to state and profound in its implications. Stop trying to fix your thoughts and start learning to regulate your nervous system. When your nervous system feels safe, your thoughts naturally become clearer, calmer, and more constructive. Not because you force them, because that is what minds do when they are not running threat detection software. When your nervous system feels safe, your emotions stop being emergencies and start being information, not obstacles to clear thinking, prerequisites for it. When your nervous system feels safe, your intelligence becomes an asset instead of a liability. The same analytical power that currently fuels your overthinking becomes available for actual problem solving. This is not theory. This is testable, measurable, reproducible neuroscience. And in the chapters ahead, I will show you exactly how it works. You will learn why smart people suffer more from overthinking, and it is not because something is wrong with them. You will learn why discipline makes anxiety worse in the long run and what to do instead. You will learn how to recognize the gap between stimulus and response where freedom actually lives. You will learn to convert the pressure that currently breaks you down into the presence that others trust and follow. But none of that will matter if you do not understand the foundation we are building on. You are not broken. You were never broken. Your nervous system has been doing its job with extraordinary dedication, protecting you, warning you, trying desperately to keep you safe in a world it does not understand. The problem is not that your system is malfunctioning. The problem is that it is calibrated for a world that no longer exists. The threats it evolved to detect, predators, tribal rejection, physical danger, have been replaced by abstractions it cannot fight and cannot flee. Emails, evaluations, expectations, social media comparisons. The undefined dread of a future that might go wrong in ways you cannot specify. Your ancient alarm system is stuck in the on position because it cannot find the off switch for threats that have no resolution. And every time you blamed yourself for not being able to think your way out of this trap, you added one more threat to the list. Now you are not just anxious. You are anxious about being anxious. You are not just exhausted. You are exhausted by your exhaustion. The system has turned on itself, and the very effort to escape has become another wall of the prison. This stops now, not through more effort, through understanding, not through fighting yourself, through finally, truly seeing yourself. In the next chapter, I will show you the exact architecture of what I call the overloaded mind loop, the 5-stage process that takes a normal nervous system response and turns it into chronic suffering. Once you see it, you will never unsee it. And once you understand it, you will know exactly where to intervene. But before we go there, I want you to sit with something for a moment. The exhaustion you feel is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of how hard you have been fighting. The anxiety that plagues you is not evidence of brokenness. It is evidence of a protection system that never learned when to stand down. The overthinking that consumes you is not evidence of a flawed mind. It is evidence of a powerful mind searching for solutions to problems that cannot be solved through thinking. Everything you have experienced makes sense, not as pathology, as mechanism, not as personal failure, as systemic response. You are not the problem that needs to be fixed. You are the person who was never given the right map. Until now. Chapter 2. The Overloaded Mind Loop. Your brain runs approximately 60,000 thoughts per day. But here is what researchers at Queen's University discovered in their 2020 study that changes everything. In people experiencing chronic anxiety, 90% of those thoughts are repetitions. Not new information, not creative problem solving, just the same mental loops playing on repeat, consuming energy, producing nothing. You have felt this. That sense of thinking hard all day, but having nothing to show for it. The exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from a mind that refuses to rest. The frustration of knowing you are smart enough to solve your problems, but somehow never arriving at a solution that sticks. This is not a thinking problem. This is a loop problem. And until you understand how the loop works, you will keep feeding it while believing you are fighting it. In this chapter, I am going to show you the exact architecture of what I call the overloaded mind loop. You will see the 5 stages that create it, the hidden fuel that keeps it running, and most importantly, the specific point where it can be interrupted. This is the foundational framework that everything else in this book builds upon. Miss this, and the strategies will feel like surface-level tricks. Understand this, and you will finally see why nothing has worked until now. Let me walk you through it. Stage 1 is the trigger. Something happens in your environment that your nervous system registers as potentially threatening. Notice I said potentially. The trigger does not need to be an actual danger. It only needs to resemble one closely enough to activate your survival programming. An unexpected email from your manager. A pause in conversation that feels awkward. A comment from a colleague that might have been criticism. A notification that reminds you of something unfinished. These are not life-threatening events. But to a nervous system calibrated for a dangerous world, they carry the same weight. Here is what most people miss about triggers. The size of the external event has almost no relationship to the size of the internal response. A small ambiguity can create massive activation. A major crisis can sometimes feel surprisingly manageable. The variable is not the event itself. The variable is how closely the event matches patterns your nervous system has learned to flag as dangerous. A study from the University of California, Los Angeles examined threat perception in high-achieving professionals. What they found was counterintuitive. The participants who reported the highest levels of chronic anxiety were not facing more actual threats than their calmer peers. They were detecting threats earlier, at lower thresholds, with higher false positive rates. Their systems were more sensitive, not because they were broken, but because they had been trained by experience to prioritize early detection over accurate detection. This is important. Your nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that its calibration settings were established in circumstances that no longer apply. Stage 2 is activation. Once a trigger is detected, your autonomic nervous system shifts into a mobilization state. Heart rate increases slightly. Breathing becomes shallower. Muscles tense in preparation for action. Stress hormones begin to circulate. This happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness, in approximately 100 milliseconds. Before you have time to think about whether the threat is real, your body has already begun responding to it. Most people never notice stage 2 happening. They skip directly to the experience of anxiety without recognizing the physical activation that preceded it. This is critical because it means they are trying to solve the problem at the wrong level. They are attempting to think their way out of a state that did not originate in thought. Now we arrive at stage 3, and this is where the loop begins to form. Your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, receives signals from your activated body. Something is wrong, the body says. Find out what. Fix it. So the mind does what minds do. It thinks. It analyzes. It searches for the source of the threat. It runs scenarios. It considers possibilities. It tries to solve the problem. But here is the trap. The original trigger was ambiguous. An email that might mean something bad. A social moment that might have been awkward. A future outcome that might not go well. There is no concrete action to take. No clear solution to implement. No way to definitively resolve the uncertainty. And because the threat cannot be resolved through thinking, the thinking continues indefinitely. Average performers get stuck here and assume more thinking is the answer. They believe if they just analyze long enough, the solution will appear. So they think harder. They think longer. They review the same information from slightly different angles, hoping something new will emerge. Elite performers recognize something different. They understand that when thinking produces no resolution after the first few cycles, additional thinking will not change the outcome. It will only deepen the loop. So instead of thinking harder, they interrupt the pattern. Not through willpower, not through distraction, but through understanding that continued analysis is no longer serving a protective function. Stage 4 is where the damage accumulates. Because your thinking has not resolved the underlying activation, your nervous system remains in alert mode. Your body is still preparing for action that never comes. Stress hormones continue circulating. Cognitive resources continue depleting. And now something insidious happens. Your brain interprets this ongoing activation as evidence. If my body is still activated, something must still be wrong. If I have not found the solution yet, I must need to think more. If I am still anxious, the threat must still be present. This is the feedback loop that traps intelligent people for years. The very persistence of the anxiety becomes proof that more anxiety is warranted. The inability to think your way out becomes evidence that you have not thought hard enough. You are now using the symptom to justify the cause. Stage 5 is depletion. After running this cycle repeatedly, sometimes dozens of times in a single day, your system reaches a state of functional exhaustion. Cognitive bandwidth is consumed. Emotional regulation capacity is diminished. Physical energy reserves are depleted from maintaining chronic low-grade activation. You feel tired in a way that sleep does not fully restore. Because the tiredness is not from exertion. It is from expenditure. Your resources were spent fighting invisible threats that never materialized. And here is the cruelest part. In this depleted state, your threat detection becomes even more sensitive. Your threshold for triggering the loop drops even lower. You become reactive to smaller and smaller provocations. Not because you are weak, but because you are empty. You no longer have the buffer that would allow you to absorb minor stressors without activation. This is why anxious people often describe feeling like they are getting worse over time despite trying harder to get better. They are not imagining it. The loop is progressive. Each cycle makes the next cycle more likely. Now let me show you something that changes everything. There is a point in this loop where intervention is possible. A moment where the pattern can be interrupted before it completes its cycle. Most approaches miss this point entirely because they target the wrong stage. Positive thinking tries to intervene at stage 3 by changing the content of thoughts. But the thoughts are not the cause. They are the symptom of activation that has already occurred. Changing what you think about does not change the fact that your nervous system has already mobilized. Relaxation techniques try to intervene at stage 2 by calming the body. This can help temporarily. But if the underlying trigger pattern remains unchanged, activation will simply return at the next provocation. Avoidance tries to intervene at stage 1 by eliminating triggers. But triggers are infinite. You cannot remove every possible source of ambiguity from your environment. And the attempt to do so often creates new anxieties about the avoided situations. The intervention point that actually works is between stage 2 and stage 3. After activation has occurred, but before the thinking loop begins. This is the gap where awareness can enter. The moment where you can recognize that your body has activated without automatically launching into analysis mode. In that gap, something remarkable becomes possible. You can feel the activation without feeding it. You can notice the urge to analyze without obeying it. You can allow the nervous system response to exist while choosing not to add cognitive fuel to the fire. This is not suppression. Suppression would mean pushing down the activation, which actually intensifies it. This is something different. This is allowing the activation to be present while declining to elaborate on it mentally. Researchers at Harvard Medical School tested this exact intervention in a 2018 study on anxiety disorders. Participants who were trained to recognize the gap between physical activation and cognitive elaboration showed a 63% reduction in anxiety symptoms over 8 weeks. Not through changing their circumstances, not through positive thinking, simply through learning to notice the moment before the loop begins and making a different choice in that moment. The average person experiences activation and immediately starts thinking. The whole process feels like one unified experience. Trigger, activation, thought, more thought, exhaustion. Seamless, automatic, inevitable. But it is not inevitable. There is a space in there, a gap that can be widened with practice. And in that gap lies your freedom. In the chapters ahead, I will teach you exactly how to find this gap in real time, how to recognize activation before it becomes elaboration, how to widen the space between stimulus and response until you have genuine choice about what happens next. But first, we need to address something that keeps intelligent people trapped in this loop longer than anyone else. We need to understand why smart people overthink more, not less, and why the very qualities that make you successful in your career are the same qualities that make you vulnerable to chronic mental exhaustion. That is where we go next. Chapter 3: Why Smart People Overthink More. The higher your IQ, the more likely you are to suffer from anxiety and overthinking. This is not speculation. This is the conclusion of a landmark study published in the journal Intelligence that analyzed data from over 10,000 participants across 2 decades. Researchers found a direct correlation between cognitive ability and rumination. The smarter the person, the deeper the mental loops. And here is the part that will either frustrate you or finally make sense of your experience. Your overthinking is not a malfunction of your intelligence. It is your intelligence working exactly as designed, applied to a problem category it was never meant to solve. You have probably noticed this pattern in your own life. The most successful people you know, the ones with the sharpest minds and the most impressive achievements, are often the same people who cannot turn off their brains at night, who analyze conversations for hours after they have ended, who see 17 possible outcomes for every decision while others see 2. This is not coincidence. This is cause and effect. In this chapter, I am going to show you why intelligence creates vulnerability to overthinking, how your greatest cognitive strength becomes your greatest emotional liability, and most importantly, how to redirect that mental horsepower toward problems it can actually solve. Let me start with a question that seems simple but reveals everything. What is intelligence actually for? From an evolutionary perspective, human intelligence developed primarily as a problem-solving mechanism. Our ancestors faced concrete challenges: finding food, building shelter, navigating social hierarchies, predicting weather patterns, avoiding predators. For millions of years, the humans who could analyze situations, identify patterns, and project future outcomes survived at higher rates than those who could not. Intelligence was selected for because it solved survival problems, and it was spectacularly good at this. The human brain can process complex variables, hold multiple scenarios in working memory, and arrive at optimal solutions faster than any other biological system on the planet. When pointed at a concrete problem with definable parameters and actionable solutions, your intelligence is the most powerful tool in existence. But here is where the mismatch occurs. The problems that trigger your anxiety are almost never concrete. They are abstract, ambiguous, undefined. What does my manager really think of me? Will this relationship work out? Am I making the right career choices? What if I fail? What if I succeed and then fail? What if something goes wrong that I cannot even anticipate yet? These are not problems in the traditional sense. They are uncertainties. And there is a fundamental difference between a problem and an uncertainty that your intelligence was never taught to recognize. A problem has a structure. It has inputs, constraints, and a definable solution space. When you apply analytical thinking to a problem, you move closer to resolution. Each cycle of analysis narrows the possibilities. Eventually, you arrive at an answer. An uncertainty has no such structure. It is open-ended. The variables are undefined. The solution space is infinite. And when you apply analytical thinking to an uncertainty, something strange happens. Instead of narrowing the possibilities, you expand them. Each cycle of analysis generates more scenarios to consider, more angles to examine, more potential outcomes to worry about. This is why smart people get stuck in loops while others move on. Your analytical power is too strong. You can generate more scenarios than you can resolve. You can see more risks than you can mitigate. You can imagine more futures than you can prepare for. The very capability that makes you excellent at solving real problems makes you terrible at leaving unsolvable uncertainties alone. Researchers at the University of Sussex examined this phenomenon directly. They gave participants a series of tasks, some with clear solutions and some deliberately ambiguous with no right answer. High IQ participants dramatically outperformed others on the solvable tasks. But on the ambiguous tasks, the pattern reversed. High IQ participants spent significantly more time, reported higher frustration, and showed elevated stress markers compared to average IQ participants. The researchers concluded that higher cognitive ability creates higher intolerance for unresolved ambiguity. Smart people are not just capable of more analysis. They feel compelled toward it. Leaving something unresolved feels almost physically uncomfortable when your brain is wired to find patterns and close loops. Now let me show you how this plays out in real life, because understanding the mechanism is only useful if you can see it operating in your own experience. Imagine two people receive the same ambiguous email from their supervisor. The email says we need to talk about your recent project. Nothing more. No tone indicators. No context. Just a meeting request. The average thinker registers this as uncertain, feels a brief spike of nervousness, and then moves on. They might wonder what it is about, but the wondering does not consume them. They lack the cognitive horsepower to generate elaborate scenarios, so they simply wait to find out. The intelligent thinker has a very different experience. Within minutes, their brain has generated a dozen possible interpretations. It could be criticism. It could be praise. It could be a reassignment. Maybe they noticed the error in section 3. Or maybe they want to discuss the budget implications. But what if it is a performance issue? What was their tone in the last meeting? Did they seem distant? Were there any warning signs? Each scenario spawns sub-scenarios. Each possibility generates counter-possibilities. The analytical engine is running at full capacity, doing exactly what it was designed to do, producing exactly nothing useful, because the email is genuinely ambiguous. No amount of analysis will reveal its meaning before the actual meeting occurs. But try telling that to a brain that has solved 10,000 problems through analysis and has no other tool in its repertoire. This is the intelligence trap. You are using the right tool for the wrong job. And because the tool is so powerful, it takes a long time to realize it is not working. Here is where elite performers diverge from everyone else. Average high performers respond to this frustration by trying harder. They assume their analysis is failing because they have not analyzed deeply enough. So they think more, examine more angles, run more scenarios. This feels productive because it is effortful. But effort without appropriate application is just exhaustion with extra steps. Elite high performers recognize a different pattern. They notice when analysis stops producing new information and starts producing new anxiety. They have developed the metacognitive awareness to step outside their thinking and evaluate whether thinking is the appropriate response to the current situation. This is not about being less intelligent. It is about being intelligent about your intelligence. Knowing when to deploy your analytical power and when to conserve it. Understanding that some situations call for processing and other situations call for presence. The distinction is subtle but transformative. Processing means engaging your analytical capabilities to work through information toward resolution. Presence means allowing a situation to exist without requiring immediate cognitive resolution. Your intelligence is biased entirely toward processing. It wants to work on every input it receives. It treats every uncertainty as a problem to be solved. But this bias, left unchecked, creates a life where you are never mentally at rest, where every ambiguity becomes a project, where your own mind becomes the most demanding boss you have ever had. A study from Princeton University examined what they called cognitive deployment patterns in high-achieving professionals. They tracked when and how participants engaged their analytical capabilities throughout the day. The finding that stood out was this. Participants who struggled with anxiety showed no off switch for their analytical processing. Their brains treated a conversation with a stranger the same as a complex work problem. A decision about dinner received the same cognitive resources as a career choice. Everything was analyzed at maximum intensity. The participants who reported higher well-being and equal professional success showed something different. They demonstrated what the researchers called selective deployment. They could distinguish between situations that warranted full analytical engagement and situations that did not. They had learned, either explicitly or intuitively, to match their cognitive expenditure to the actual requirements of each moment. This is learnable. It is not a personality trait you either have or lack. It is a skill that can be developed through understanding and practice. And it begins with recognizing a truth that your intelligence has been obscuring from you. Not every thought deserves your attention. Not every uncertainty requires resolution. Not every ambiguity is a threat in disguise. Your brain will resist this idea. It will generate convincing arguments for why this particular uncertainty is different, why this specific situation really does require more analysis, why you cannot afford to let this one go unexamined. This resistance is not evidence that your brain is right. It is evidence that your analytical system does not know how to stop itself. Think of it like an engine without a governor. A governor is a device that limits how fast an engine can run to prevent it from destroying itself. Your analytical intelligence has no natural governor. It will run at full speed until it burns out, never recognizing that the speed itself is the problem. The chapters that follow will teach you how to install that governor, how to recognize when your intelligence is helping versus when it is hurting, how to create intentional boundaries around your analytical processing so that your greatest strength stops being your greatest source of exhaustion. But before we can do that, we need to go one level deeper. We need to understand the system that is driving this entire process. Not your thoughts, not your intelligence, but the nervous system infrastructure that determines when and how your cognitive resources get deployed. Because here is what no one told you. Your overthinking is not actually a mental habit. It is a nervous system response. And until you address it at that level, every technique will be a temporary patch on a permanent leak. That is what we explore next. Chapter 4. The Nervous System Truth. Everything you have been taught about anxiety is incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but missing the most important piece. For decades, the dominant model has been cognitive. Anxiety is a thought problem. Change your thoughts, change your feelings. Reframe the negative, emphasize the positive, and eventually your emotional state will follow. This model has helped millions of people, but it has also left millions more frustrated, wondering why techniques that work for others produce nothing for them. Wondering why their positive affirmations feel hollow, why their reframes do not stick, why they can understand intellectually that their fears are irrational while still feeling completely controlled by them. Here is the piece that has been missing. Anxiety does not start in your thoughts. It starts in your nervous system. And trying to fix a nervous system problem with cognitive techniques is like trying to cool down an overheated engine by repainting the car. You are working on the wrong system entirely. In this chapter, I am going to show you what is actually happening in your body when you experience anxiety. Not the surface-level explanation you have heard before. The deep neurobiological reality that changes everything about how you approach your own mind. Once you understand this, you will never think about your anxiety the same way again. Let me start with a discovery that transformed modern neuroscience. In 1994, Dr. Stephen Porges at the University of Illinois published a paper introducing what he called polyvagal theory. This was not a minor contribution. It fundamentally rewrote our understanding of how the human nervous system operates, particularly under stress. 20 years later, the implications of his work are still reshaping therapy, medicine, and our basic conception of what emotions actually are. Here is the core insight. Your autonomic nervous system does not have two states, as previously believed. It has three, and these three states are organized in a hierarchy that determines not just how you feel, but how you perceive, think, and relate to others. The oldest system, evolutionarily speaking, is the dorsal vagal complex. This is your freeze response. When threat is overwhelming and neither fight nor flight is possible, this system takes over. It immobilizes. It dissociates. It conserves energy by shutting down non-essential functions. In extreme cases, it produces the collapse and numbness that trauma survivors often describe. The second system is the sympathetic nervous system. This is your fight or flight response. When threat is detected and action is possible, this system mobilizes. Heart rate increases. Blood pressure rises. Stress hormones flood the bloodstream. Energy is directed toward muscles and away from digestion, immune function, and higher cognition. You are prepared to act. The third and newest system is the ventral vagal complex. This is your social engagement system. When safety is detected, this system activates. Heart rate variability increases. Facial muscles relax. Voice tone softens. The middle ear attunes to human speech frequencies. You become capable of connection, creativity, and complex thought. Here is what matters for understanding your anxiety. These three systems are not just different responses. They create entirely different experiences of reality. When your ventral vagal system is active, the world looks safe. Problems seem manageable. Other people seem trustworthy. You have access to your full cognitive capabilities. When your sympathetic system takes over, everything shifts. The same world now looks threatening. The same problems seem overwhelming. The same people seem potentially hostile. Your thinking narrows to immediate survival concerns. And this shift happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness, before you have any say in the matter. This is why you cannot think your way out of anxiety in the moment. The state you are in determines what thoughts are even available to you. When your nervous system is mobilized for threat, calm and rational thoughts are neurobiologically inaccessible. They exist in a different operating system that is currently offline. A study at Yale University demonstrated this with elegant simplicity. Researchers induced mild stress in participants through unpredictable loud noises, then asked them to solve problems and make decisions. Compared to a control group, the stressed participants showed significantly impaired performance on complex reasoning tasks. But here is the crucial part. When asked to rate their own cognitive ability, the stressed participants did not report feeling less capable. Their subjective experience of their own thinking remained unchanged even as their actual performance declined. This means you cannot trust your in-the-moment assessment of your own cognition when you are activated. You feel like you are thinking clearly. You feel like your analysis is valid. But your nervous system state has already constrained what conclusions you can reach. You are reasoning within a prison you cannot see. Now let me connect this to everything we have discussed so far. Remember the overloaded mind loop from Chapter 2. Trigger, activation, thinking, more thinking, depletion. Now you can see what is actually happening at a biological level. The trigger shifts your nervous system from ventral vagal into sympathetic activation. This shift is immediate and automatic. Your body is now in threat response mode. From this mobilized state, your brain attempts to solve the problem through analysis. But analysis requires the prefrontal cortex, which has reduced blood flow during sympathetic activation. You are trying to use a cognitive tool that has been partially disabled by the very state you are trying to think your way out of. No wonder the loops never resolve. You are bringing diminished capacity to an impossible task. And here is where intelligent people get trapped longest. Because you have successfully thought your way through so many problems before, you assume this problem is also solvable through thinking. You do not recognize that the rules have changed, that this is not a problem at all in the solvable sense. It is a state, and states are not resolved through analysis. They are resolved through regulation. The average person tries to think better thoughts. They engage in cognitive warfare with their own mind, trying to argue themselves into feeling differently. This occasionally produces temporary relief, but it never addresses the underlying activation. The nervous system remains in threat mode, generating new anxious content as fast as the old content is reframed. The elite performer recognizes that the thoughts are symptoms, not causes. They understand that their primary task is not to change what they are thinking, but to change the state from which they are thinking. Regulate the nervous system first. Then, from a regulated state, thought naturally reorganizes itself. This is not a subtle distinction. It is the difference between treating a fever with ice packs on the forehead versus treating the infection causing the fever. One addresses symptoms indefinitely. The other resolves the source. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice. Imagine you have a difficult presentation tomorrow. Your mind starts generating worry. What if you forget your points? What if they ask questions you cannot answer? What if you lose credibility with your team? The cognitive approach says to challenge these thoughts. Find evidence against them. Remind yourself of past successes. Replace the negative predictions with positive ones. The nervous system approach says something different. First, recognize that these thoughts are being generated by a mobilized nervous system. Your body has detected potential social threat and has shifted into protection mode. The thoughts are not independent analyses. They are threat state outputs. Arguing with them is like arguing with a smoke alarm while ignoring the fire. Instead of engaging with the thought content, address the state directly. Activate your ventral vagal system through one of the methods that signals safety to your nervous system. Extended exhale breathing, where your out-breath is longer than your in-breath, directly stimulates the vagus nerve. Cold water on your face triggers the dive reflex, which activates parasympathetic response. Humming or singing engages the vagal pathways through the larynx. These are not relaxation techniques in the traditional sense. They are nervous system interventions. They work not by making you feel calm, but by changing the physiological state from which feelings arise. And when the state changes, the thoughts change automatically without any cognitive effort whatsoever. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose research at Boston University has shaped modern trauma treatment, puts it directly in his work. The body keeps the score, meaning that your nervous system maintains a running tally of safety and threat that operates completely independently of your conscious beliefs. You can believe intellectually that you are safe while your body remains convinced of danger. And in that conflict, the body always wins. This is why trauma survivors can know that the past is over while still feeling constantly threatened. Why people with anxiety can recognize their fears are irrational while still being completely controlled by them. The conscious mind and the nervous system are running different assessments. And behavior, emotion, and thought are all downstream of the nervous system assessment, not the conscious one. Here is the paradigm shift I need you to make before we go any further. Stop thinking of anxiety as something you have and start thinking of it as something your nervous system does. Stop treating it as a character trait and start treating it as a physiological response. This is not semantics. This changes everything about how you approach the problem. When anxiety is something you have, you are the problem. You need to be fixed. There is something wrong with you that needs to be corrected through sufficient effort and correct thinking. When anxiety is something your nervous system does, you are not the problem. Your system is responding to cues it has learned to interpret as threatening. There is nothing wrong with you. There is a calibration issue with your threat detection apparatus. And calibration can be adjusted. A study from the University of North Carolina tracked 2 groups of anxiety patients over 6 months. One group received traditional cognitive behavioral therapy focused on changing thought patterns. The other group received what researchers called bottom-up intervention focused on nervous system regulation through breathwork, movement, and interoceptive awareness. Both groups showed improvement, but the nervous system group showed something additional. Their improvements persisted at 12-month follow-up at significantly higher rates than the cognitive group. Once the nervous system learned a new baseline, it maintained that baseline more durably than cognitive reframes alone. This is the nervous system truth that changes everything. Your anxiety is not a thinking problem with physical symptoms. It is a physical state with cognitive symptoms. And until you address it at the physical level, you will be forever managing symptoms instead of resolving causes. In the chapters ahead, I will teach you exactly how to work with your nervous system instead of against it, how to recognize the signals it is sending, how to respond in ways that create safety rather than perpetuating threat, how to gradually recalibrate a system that has learned to see danger everywhere. But first, we need to address the raw material your nervous system is working with. We need to talk about emotions themselves. Because everything you have been taught about emotions, what they are, what they mean, how to handle them, is probably making your anxiety worse. Your emotions are not the enemy. They are information. And learning to read that information correctly is the next essential step. Chapter 5. Emotion is information, not a threat. 91% of high-achieving professionals report actively suppressing their emotions at work. And according to research from the University of Texas, every single one of them is paying a hidden cost they do not even know exists. The cost is not psychological. It is cognitive. Every emotion you suppress steals processing power from your thinking brain. And you have been doing it so long, you have forgotten what full capacity even feels like. Here is the uncomfortable truth that nobody in the productivity world wants to admit. Your emotions are not obstacles to clear thinking. They are prerequisites for it. The neuroscience is unambiguous on this point. People who lose access to their emotional processing through brain injury become incapable of making even simple decisions. Not because they become irrational, but because rationality itself depends on emotional input to function. Everything you have been taught about emotions in professional settings is backwards. And until you reverse that programming, you will continue bleeding cognitive resources into a battle you were never supposed to fight. In this chapter, I am going to dismantle the model of emotions you have been operating from and replace it with one that actually matches how your brain works. You will understand why your attempts to control your feelings have been exhausting you, why certain emotions keep returning no matter how many times you push them away, and how to transform your emotional experience from a liability into possibly your greatest asset. Let me start by exposing the lie you have been living inside. The dominant cultural model treats emotions as disruptions. Feelings are framed as irrational intrusions into an otherwise logical process. Professional environments reward emotional suppression. Stay calm. Do not let them see you sweat. Keep your feelings out of it. The implicit message is clear. Emotions are weaknesses. Mature, successful people control them. This model is not just wrong. It is physiologically impossible. And attempting to live by it creates the exact exhaustion and anxiety you are trying to escape. Dr. Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California has spent 3 decades studying the relationship between emotion and cognition. His research on patients with damage to emotional processing regions of the brain reveals something that should have rewritten every business book and self-help guide of the last 50 years. Without emotional input, rational decision-making collapses entirely. His most famous case study involved a patient called Elliot. Before his brain injury, Elliot was a successful professional with a stable career and family. After surgery removed a tumor along with part of his emotional processing architecture, his IQ remained unchanged. His logical reasoning tested normal, but his life fell apart completely. He could not decide what to eat for lunch. He could not prioritize tasks. He would spend hours analyzing trivial choices without reaching conclusions. His marriage ended. He lost his job. He burned through his savings on bad investments. Elliot could think perfectly clearly. What he could not do was feel. And without feeling, thinking produced nothing useful. Because here is what Damasio discovered. Emotions are not separate from rational thought. They are the foundation of it. Every decision you make, from what to have for breakfast to whether to take a new job, relies on emotional weighting to reduce infinite options to manageable choices. When you feel drawn towards something, that is emotional information narrowing your decision space. When you feel resistance towards something, that is emotional information flagging potential problems. When you feel nothing, you have no basis for choosing at all. You can analyze forever because analysis without emotional input has no stopping point. This is why the overloaded mind loop never resolves through thinking alone. Your thinking is searching for an answer, but answers require emotional closure to register as complete. Without that feeling of resolution, of yes, this is right, analysis continues indefinitely. You are waiting for a signal that your suppressed emotional system is no longer equipped to send. Now let me show you what emotions actually are, because the word itself has been corrupted by misuse. Emotions are not feelings in the vague sense that word usually implies. Emotions are information packets. They are your nervous system's way of communicating complex assessments about your environment, your relationships, and your needs in a format faster than conscious thought can process. When you feel anxiety, that is not irrationality. That is your system detecting a mismatch between your current situation and your needs for safety or certainty. When you feel anger, That is your system detecting a boundary violation or an obstacle to something important. When you feel sadness, that is your system signaling loss or the need to withdraw and process. Each emotion carries specific information. And like any information source, emotions can be accurate or inaccurate, calibrated or miscalibrated, helpful or misleading. But cutting off the information source entirely does not improve your decision-making. It cripples it. The average person treats emotions like malfunctions to be corrected. They feel anxiety and immediately try to make it stop. They feel anger and clamp down on it. They feel sadness and push through it. Every emotional signal is treated as a problem to be solved rather than information to be understood. Elite performers do something fundamentally different. They treat emotions as data. When they feel anxiety, their first response is not "how do I stop this," but "what is this telling me?" They have learned to read emotional signals the way a skilled sailor reads the wind. Not as obstacles to fight, but as information to navigate by. This distinction changes everything about the experience of emotion. When you fight your feelings, you create internal conflict. Your nervous system sends a signal. Your conscious mind rejects it. The nervous system, which does not understand rejection, sends the signal again, louder. You suppress harder. It amplifies further. This is why emotions you push away keep returning with greater intensity. You are not failing to suppress them. You are succeeding at creating an internal war. When you read your feelings instead, the dynamic reverses. Your nervous system sends a signal. You receive it, acknowledge it, and extract its information. The nervous system, having successfully delivered its message, reduces activation. The emotion completes its natural cycle and dissipates. Not because you forced it away, but because it fulfilled its function. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology tested this directly. Researchers asked one group of participants to suppress their emotional reactions while watching disturbing videos. A second group was asked to simply observe their emotional reactions without trying to change them. The suppression group showed increased sympathetic nervous system activation, elevated blood pressure, and impaired memory for the video content. The observation group showed normal physiological responses, stable blood pressure, and better recall. Suppression is not free. It costs biological resources and cognitive capacity, and it does not even work. The emotions you suppress do not disappear. They go underground, continuing to influence your perception, your decisions, and your behavior while consuming energy to keep them out of awareness. Here is the model I want you to operate from instead. I call it the emotional information framework. First principle: every emotion is attempting to communicate something. Your job is not to stop the communication, but to understand it. Anxiety is communicating perceived threat or uncertainty. Anger is communicating boundary violation or blocked goals. Sadness is communicating loss or unmet needs. Frustration is communicating effort without progress. Each signal has meaning. Second principle: the intensity of an emotion reflects the perceived importance of the message, not necessarily the actual importance. Your nervous system might generate intense anxiety about something objectively minor because that minor thing resembles a pattern from your past that was genuinely dangerous. The intensity tells you how important your system thinks this is. It does not tell you whether your system is correct. Third principle: emotions that are received and acknowledged complete their cycle naturally. Emotions that are resisted, suppressed, or ignored continue signaling with increasing intensity. The fastest way through an emotion is through, not around. Fourth principle: you can feel an emotion fully without being controlled by it. Feeling and acting are separate capacities. You can feel intense anger without yelling. You can feel deep sadness without collapsing. You can feel significant anxiety without fleeing. The goal is not to eliminate the feeling, but to maintain choice about the response. This fourth principle is where most people get confused. They believe that if they allow themselves to feel an emotion, they will be overwhelmed by it. That the only thing standing between them and emotional chaos is their constant suppression. This belief is not just wrong. It is the cause of most emotional dysregulation. Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has demonstrated what happens neurologically when people label their emotions accurately. When participants in his studies named what they were feeling, even briefly and silently, activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat center, decreased significantly. Meanwhile, activity in the prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation and executive function, increased. Simply acknowledging an emotion begins regulating it. You do not need elaborate techniques. You do not need to analyze the feeling into oblivion. You just need to recognize it accurately. I am feeling anxious right now. I am noticing anger arising. There is sadness here. This is not suppression. It is not amplification. It is recognition. And recognition alone shifts the neural balance from reactive to regulated. Let me show you how this applies to the anxiety cycle specifically. When anxiety arises, your conditioned response is probably to resist it. You feel the activation beginning and immediately start fighting. You tell yourself there is nothing to worry about. You try to distract yourself. You push the feeling down and try to proceed as normal. This resistance sends a signal to your nervous system. Something is wrong. Even my own emotions are threats. This paradoxically confirms the danger your anxiety was trying to warn you about. The system ramps up further. Now you have more anxiety to suppress, which requires more energy, which depletes more resources, which reduces your capacity to handle the original situation, which generates more anxiety. The alternative is radical and simple. When anxiety arises, receive it, not with resignation, not with despair, with curiosity. What is this trying to tell me? Where is this coming from? What does my system perceive as threatening right now? Sometimes the answer reveals something genuinely useful. You realize you are anxious because you are underprepared for tomorrow's meeting, and the appropriate response is to prepare more. Sometimes the answer reveals a miscalibration. You realize you are anxious because a current situation resembles an old, painful experience, but the actual danger has passed. Either way, the information is valuable. And here is what happens next that changes everything. The moment you receive anxiety as information instead of fighting it as an enemy, your nervous system begins downregulating. The message has been delivered. The communication was successful. The system can return to baseline. This is not a technique you deploy in crisis. It is a fundamental reorientation to your own inner experience. It is the recognition that your emotions have never been the enemy. They have been allies sending signals you were trained to ignore. In the next chapter, we need to address why all the standard advice has failed you. Why discipline does not fix anxiety. Why willpower eventually depletes. Why the strategies that work for average problems make exceptional problems worse. Because understanding what emotions are is only half the equation. You also need to understand why everything you have tried so far has been pointed in the wrong direction. Chapter 6. Why discipline doesn't fix anxiety. The most disciplined people you know are often the most anxious. This is not coincidence. It is cause and effect. A study from the American Psychological Association tracked over 3,000 high achievers across 5 years and found something that contradicts everything the self-improvement industry teaches. The participants who scored highest on measures of self-discipline were 47% more likely to develop chronic anxiety than their less disciplined peers. Read that again. More discipline correlated with more anxiety, not less. If you have spent years building habits, forcing yourself through discomfort, and pushing past resistance, you already sense that something about this approach is not working. You have the discipline. You have proven it 1,000 times. Yet the anxiety remains. Maybe it has even gotten worse. And every book, every course, every mentor keeps telling you the same thing. Try harder. Be more consistent. Build stronger systems. This chapter is going to explain why that advice is not just unhelpful for anxiety. It is actively making it worse. And once you understand why, you will finally be able to stop fighting yourself and start working with the grain of how your mind actually operates. Let me start with what discipline actually is at a neurological level. Discipline is the capacity to override immediate impulses in service of longer-term goals. When you wake up tired but go to the gym anyway, that is discipline. When you feel like snapping at a colleague but maintain composure, that is discipline. When you want to scroll social media but return to your work instead, that is discipline. This capacity lives primarily in your prefrontal cortex, the newest part of your brain evolutionarily. the part responsible for executive function, planning, and impulse control. And here is the critical fact that changes everything about how you should approach anxiety. Your prefrontal cortex runs on a limited resource. Dr. Roy Baumeister at Florida State University conducted the foundational research on what he called ego depletion. His experiments demonstrated that self-control draws from a finite pool. Participants who exerted willpower on one task showed significantly reduced capacity for willpower on subsequent tasks. The resource depleted with use and required time to replenish. Subsequent research has refined this model, but the core finding holds. Effortful self-regulation is metabolically expensive. Your brain consumes glucose at elevated rates during acts of discipline. The prefrontal cortex, which represents only about 4% of brain volume, can consume up to 20% of your total energy budget when working hard. And there is a ceiling on how much it can sustain. Now apply this to anxiety. When you experience anxiety and try to discipline your way through it, what actually happens in your brain? Your prefrontal cortex attempts to override the emotional signals coming from your amygdala and nervous system. This is effortful. This consumes resources. This is an act of willpower like any other. But here is the difference between anxiety and other challenges that yield to discipline. When you discipline yourself to go to the gym, you complete the workout and the task is done. The willpower expenditure has a finish line. When you discipline yourself through anxiety, there is no finish line. The anxiety is not a task to complete. It is a state your nervous system is generating continuously. So you apply discipline. You push through. You force yourself to function despite the internal alarm bells. This works. For a while, you feel accomplished. You managed your anxiety through sheer force of will. But the nervous system did not turn off. It kept generating threat signals the entire time. And you kept spending prefrontal resources to override those signals. Hour after hour, day after day. This is unsustainable. Not because you lack discipline, because the math does not work. You are spending a finite resource against an infinite demand. Eventually, the resource depletes. And when it does, the anxiety you are holding back comes flooding through with compound interest. This is why highly disciplined people often describe their anxiety as coming in waves. Long periods of managed functioning followed by crashes where everything falls apart. They interpret the crashes as personal failure. If only I had been more disciplined, it would not have happened. So they resolve to try harder next time, to build stronger walls, to exert more control. And the cycle continues. More discipline, more depletion, bigger crashes, more shame, more resolve, more discipline, until something breaks that cannot be fixed with willpower alone. The average person responds to this pattern by doubling down. They read books on habit formation. They build more elaborate systems. They schedule their discipline. They turn self-control into a lifestyle, believing that if they just perfect their approach, they will finally outrun the anxiety. Elite performers recognize a different truth. They understand that discipline is a tool with specific applications and inherent limitations. It is excellent for initiating action, maintaining focus during defined tasks, and building behavioral patterns. It is terrible for regulating ongoing emotional states. Using discipline for anxiety is like using a hammer for surgery. The tool is powerful. It is simply wrong for this particular job. Let me show you exactly why discipline fails against anxiety specifically. Discipline works by creating opposition. You want to stay in bed. Discipline gets you up. You want to eat the cookie. Discipline says no. There is a you that wants something and a disciplined you that overrides that wanting. This oppositional structure is fine for behavioral choices, but it becomes destructive when applied to internal states. When you apply discipline to anxiety, you create an internal war. There is the anxious part of you generating distress. There is the disciplined part of you trying to suppress that distress. Now you have two systems in conflict, both consuming energy, neither able to defeat the other. The anxiety cannot complete its cycle because you will not allow it. The discipline cannot eliminate the anxiety because suppression does not resolve the underlying nervous system activation. You end up in a permanent internal battle. And battles are exhausting even when you are winning, especially when you are winning, because winning means constant vigilance. The moment you relax your discipline, the anxiety advances. So you cannot relax. Ever. That is the hidden cost of the discipline approach. Not just depletion, but the impossibility of rest. Compare this to what happens when anxiety is approached without opposition. The nervous system generates an anxiety signal. You receive the signal without fighting it. You acknowledge its presence. You extract whatever information it contains. The signal, having been received, begins to complete its natural cycle. Activation rises, peaks, and falls. No discipline required. No resource expenditure beyond simple attention. This is not passivity. It is not giving up. It is working with the architecture of your nervous system rather than against it. And it produces sustainable results where discipline produces temporary suppression followed by eventual collapse. Dr. Kristen Neff at the University of Texas has researched the alternative to discipline-based self-regulation. She calls it self-compassion. Before you dismiss this as soft psychology, consider the data. In studies comparing self-disciplined approaches to self-compassionate approaches for managing difficult emotions, the self-compassion groups showed lower cortisol levels, faster emotional recovery, better cognitive performance, and greater persistence on subsequent tasks. Not equal performance, better performance. The approach that feels like giving yourself a break actually produces superior outcomes to the approach that feels like being hard on yourself. This finding is counterintuitive if you believe that discipline drives results. It makes perfect sense if you understand resource economics. Self-compassion does not require prefrontal override. It does not create internal opposition. It does not deplete the limited pool of self-regulatory capacity. So there is more left for actual challenges that genuinely require discipline. You are not weaker for being kind to yourself. You are more strategically resourced. Let me address the objection I know is forming in your mind. If discipline is not the answer, does that mean I should just give in to my anxiety? Should I stop pushing through? Should I let it control me? No. This is the false binary that keeps people trapped. The options are not discipline or surrender. The options are unintelligent force versus intelligent cooperation. Discipline is unintelligent force when applied to anxiety. It works against the system without understanding the system. It treats symptoms while ignoring causes. It depletes resources that could be better spent elsewhere. Intelligent cooperation means understanding how your nervous system works and aligning your response with that understanding. It means recognizing that anxiety is a signal, not an enemy. That the signal contains information worth receiving. That receiving the signal allows it to complete its cycle. That completion produces natural resolution without willpower expenditure. This does not mean you stop taking action. It means you stop taking action from a place of internal warfare. You still show up. You still perform. You still meet your obligations. But you do it without the exhausting background process of fighting yourself while you work. A study from the University of California, Berkeley examined performance under stress in two groups. One group was trained to use suppression and discipline-based strategies. The other was trained in what researchers called acceptance-based strategies, essentially receiving emotional experience without opposition. Both groups faced identical stressful performance challenges. The discipline group performed adequately, but showed elevated physiological stress markers and reported significant fatigue afterward. The acceptance group performed equally well, but showed lower stress markers and recovered faster. Same external output, dramatically different internal cost. This is the key insight. Discipline extracts a tax that acceptance does not. And over time, that tax compounds. The disciplined performer pays and pays and pays until the account is empty. The acceptance-based performer maintains a sustainable balance. Now let me connect this to your specific situation as a high performer. You have succeeded precisely because you have discipline. It is one of your core strengths. Telling you to abandon discipline entirely would be absurd and counterproductive. The goal is not to eliminate discipline, but to deploy it intelligently. To use it where it works and stop using it where it creates more problems than it solves. Discipline works for behavior. Use it to start tasks, maintain focus, keep commitments. These are bounded applications with clear endpoints where willpower expenditure produces concrete returns. Discipline fails for states. Stop using it to fight anxiety, suppress emotion, or force yourself to feel differently than you do. These are unbounded applications with no endpoints where willpower expenditure produces only temporary suppression and long-term depletion. The disciplined approach to anxiety says I will not feel this way. The intelligent approach says I notice I am feeling this way. What information is here? What does my system need? One creates war. The other creates understanding. And understanding, unlike war, does not deplete your reserves. In the next chapter, we need to examine what happens when anxiety remains unaddressed over time. Because the loop does not stay static. It evolves. It deepens. It spawns secondary patterns that become problems of their own. Specifically, we need to understand the spiral that leads from anxiety to overthinking to self-doubt, and why breaking the spiral at the right point changes everything. You have been fighting the wrong battle. Now it is time to understand the actual terrain. Chapter 7. The Anxiety to Self-Doubt Spiral. 83% of professionals who report chronic anxiety also report persistent self-doubt. But here is what the research reveals that nobody talks about. The self-doubt did not cause the anxiety. The anxiety manufactured the self-doubt. And the mechanism that connects them operates so invisibly that most people spend years treating the wrong problem entirely. You have felt this. The way anxiety seems to generate evidence against you. The way one worried thought leads to questioning your competence, which leads to questioning your judgment, which leads to questioning whether you belong in your role at all. It feels like discovery, like you are finally seeing the truth about yourself that you have been avoiding. But it is not discovery. It is fabrication. Your anxious brain is building a case against you using rules of evidence that would be thrown out of any legitimate court. In this chapter, I am going to map the exact pathway from anxiety to self-doubt. You will see how each stage creates the conditions for the next. You will understand why the spiral accelerates over time and why it feels so convincing even when it is completely distorted. Most importantly, you will learn where the spiral can be interrupted before it reaches the point where recovery becomes difficult. Let me show you how the mechanism works. The spiral begins with anxiety, which, as you now understand, is a nervous system state, not a thought. Your system detects potential threat and mobilizes resources for protection. This is stage 1. Activation without specific content. A felt sense of danger that has not yet attached to any particular story. Stage 2 is where your brain does something predictable and problematic. It searches for an explanation. Your conscious mind receives signals of threat from your body and immediately asks a reasonable question. What is wrong? What is the danger? This search for explanation is automatic. You cannot stop your brain from looking for reasons any more than you can stop your eyes from focusing on movement. Here is the trap. When there is no obvious external threat, when the danger signals have no clear object, your brain turns the search inward. If nothing out there is threatening me, maybe the threat is in here. Maybe I am the problem. This is not logical. It is not evidence-based. It is simply what brains do when they cannot locate an external source for internal alarm signals. They conclude that the self must be the source. And once that conclusion is reached, confirmation bias takes over. A study at Stanford University examined this exact phenomenon. Researchers induced mild anxiety in participants using caffeine and unpredictable timing of tasks. They then asked participants to evaluate their own performance on a neutral test. The anxious participants consistently rated their performance lower than control participants, even when their actual performance was identical or better. The anxiety created a negative self-evaluation filter that distorted perception of objective results. The participants were not lying. They genuinely believed they had performed worse. The anxiety had altered their self-perception at a level below conscious manipulation. They were not choosing to doubt themselves. Their brains were automatically generating doubt as an explanation for the unexplained threat signals. This is stage 3. The anxiety has now found a home. It has attached to a story about you. I am anxious because I am not good enough. I am worried because I might fail. I am stressed because I do not really know what I am doing. The formless activation now has form. And form, even distorted form, feels like relief. At least now you know what you are dealing with. But this relief is poisonous, because now the anxiety and the self-doubt are linked. Every time anxiety arises, it brings the self-doubt story with it. And every time you think about your inadequacies, it triggers more anxiety. Two systems that were separate have become fused into a self-reinforcing loop. Here is where intelligent people suffer most. Your analytical capabilities, which we discussed in Chapter 3, now have material to work with. The vague anxiety gave your brain nothing concrete to analyze. But self-doubt is specific. It has content. It makes claims that can be examined. So your brain gets to work. Am I really qualified for this role? Let me review the evidence. Well, there was that mistake last month, and the feedback that was not entirely positive, and that meeting where I did not have a good answer. The evidence mounts. Your powerful pattern recognition system finds confirmation everywhere it looks. Because that is what pattern recognition systems do. They find patterns, even when the patterns are cherry-picked from a much larger dataset of competent performance. The average person accepts this analysis at face value. They feel anxious, generate self-doubt, find confirming evidence, and conclude that the self-doubt is warranted. This feels like insight, like finally being honest with themselves, like confronting hard truths they have been avoiding. Elite performers recognize something different. They notice that the timing is suspicious. The self-doubt intensifies precisely when anxiety is highest. The evidence against them becomes most visible exactly when their nervous system is most activated. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidence. It suggests the anxiety is driving the self-doubt, not the other way around. This recognition does not make the self-doubt disappear, but it reframes its status. Instead of truth to be accepted, it becomes data to be questioned. Where is this coming from? Is this based on balanced assessment or anxiety-filtered perception? Would I reach the same conclusion in a calm state? Usually, the answer to that last question is no. And that answer is information. Stage 4 is where the spiral deepens into something more permanent. When the anxiety to self-doubt pattern repeats enough times, it starts to become an identity. You move from I am having anxious thoughts about my competence to I am an anxious person who lacks competence. The temporary state solidifies into a trait. The situational experience becomes a story about who you are. Dr. Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan has studied how self-talk patterns shape identity over time. His research shows that people who consistently narrate their difficulties using identity-level language, I am statements, show more persistent negative mood states and less adaptive responses than people who narrate the same difficulties using experiential language, I am experiencing statements. The words you use to describe your inner experience literally change how that experience affects you. I am anxious means you are contending with a permanent characteristic. It suggests stability. It implies the anxiety is essential to who you are. I am experiencing anxiety means you are moving through a temporary state. It suggests change. It implies the anxiety is happening to you rather than defining you. This is not semantic games. The framing changes the brain's response. Identity-level statements activate regions associated with self-concept maintenance. The brain treats threats to identity as existential. It defends against them with full mobilization. Experiential statements activate regions associated with processing and integration. The brain treats experiences as information to be metabolized, not territory to be defended. When self-doubt becomes identity, you now have two problems instead of one: the original anxiety and the ego threat of questioning who you are. Every time evidence against your self-doubt appears, your brain resists it. Because accepting that evidence means revising your self-concept. And self-concept revision feels dangerous to a nervous system already on high alert. This is why some people remain stuck in self-doubt for years despite abundant evidence of their competence. The evidence is there. Their track record is clear. But integrating that evidence would require identity revision, which feels threatening, which activates the nervous system, which regenerates anxiety, which reinforces self-doubt. The spiral has become self-maintaining. Stage 5 is behavioral withdrawal. As self-doubt solidifies, you begin to avoid situations that might trigger it. You stop volunteering for challenging projects. You hesitate to share your opinions in meetings. You decline opportunities that would put your competence on display, not because you lack ability, Because the cost of potential failure, measured in anxiety and self-doubt, has become too high. The cruel irony is that this withdrawal, which feels like self-protection, actually feeds the spiral. You lose opportunities to collect evidence of your competence. Your skills stagnate because you are not stretching them. Your confidence erodes because you are not generating the wins that build it. The self-doubt that began as a distorted explanation for anxiety becomes increasingly accurate as you live smaller and smaller to avoid it. Research from Columbia Business School tracked MBA students over 3 years post-graduation. Students who showed avoidance patterns in response to early career setbacks had significantly lower career advancement than students with similar or even lower initial abilities who maintained approach behaviors. The avoidance was more damaging to their careers than the original setbacks would have been. They were not protecting themselves from failure. They were guaranteeing underperformance. Now let me show you where this spiral can be broken. The leverage point is between stage 1 and stage 2. Between the anxiety activation and the explanatory search. This is the same gap I mentioned in Chapter 2 when discussing the overloaded mind loop. It is the space where the body has activated but the mind has not yet begun constructing stories. In that gap, you can recognize activation without explanation. You can feel the anxiety without automatically asking what is wrong with me that I feel this way. This interrupts the spiral before it begins. No explanation search means no turning inward. No turning inward means no self-doubt generation. No self-doubt means no evidence gathering against yourself. No evidence means no identity solidification. No identity threat means no behavioral withdrawal. The entire cascade depends on that first moment of searching for explanation. And explanation seeking can be paused. This does not mean ignoring anxiety. It means changing your relationship to it. Instead of anxiety is telling me something is wrong, you adopt anxiety is present and may or may not be telling me anything useful. This is not denial. It is appropriate skepticism toward a signal system you now know is frequently miscalibrated. When you feel anxiety arise, you have a choice. You can ask the old question, what is wrong? Or you can ask a new question, what is present? The old question sends you searching for threats, including threats you pose to yourself. The new question simply acknowledges the current state without demanding explanation. What is present right now? Activation, tension, elevated heart rate, racing thoughts wanting to start. That is what is present, not a verdict on your competence, not a revelation about your inadequacy, just physiological activation that will pass if you allow it to pass, without elaboration. Dr. Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada developed an entire therapeutic approach around this principle. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, teaches people to recognize thoughts and feelings as events, not truths. To hold self-doubt as a thought I am having rather than a fact I must address. To make space for difficult internal experiences without being commanded by them. Research on ACT shows significant reductions in both anxiety and the self-doubt that follows it. Not by fighting the thoughts, not by replacing negative with positive, but by changing the stance toward inner experience from combatant to observer. The spiral loses power when you stop engaging with it, as if its conclusions were reliable. You do not have to believe your self-doubt. It does not matter how convincing the internal narrative sounds. How much evidence your brain has assembled, how certain you feel that the criticism is warranted. Self-doubt generated in an anxious state is inadmissible. It was produced by a system with distorted perception using methodology that would not survive scrutiny. You can acknowledge its presence without accepting its conclusions. In the next chapter, we turn from understanding the problem to implementing the solution. You have seen how anxiety operates, how the mind loops, how intelligence becomes liability, how the nervous system drives experience, how emotions carry information, how discipline fails, and how the spiral forms. Now it is time to learn the conversion process that changes everything. From pressure to presence, from reactivity to regulation, from being controlled by your states to consciously navigating through them. The transformation is not about becoming someone different. It is about accessing capacities you already have but have not been able to reach. Let me show you how. Chapter 8. From Pressure to Presence. The highest paid professionals in the world are not paid for their knowledge. They are paid for their presence under pressure. A study from the Harvard Business Review analyzed compensation data across 12 industries and found that the single greatest predictor of executive salary was not technical expertise, years of experience, or educational pedigree. It was the demonstrated ability to remain composed and clear-headed when stakes were high and outcomes were uncertain. You have seen this quality in others. The person who walks into a crisis and somehow makes everything feel more manageable just by being there. The leader who faces hostile questions without becoming defensive. The colleague who receives devastating feedback and responds with curiosity instead of collapse. There is something about their presence that changes the room. And you have probably assumed that presence is a personality trait. Something you either have or do not have. Something that cannot be learned. That assumption is wrong. Presence is not a trait. It is a skill. And in this chapter, I am going to show you exactly how it works, why pressure normally destroys it, and how to convert the very pressure that destabilizes most people into the force that generates presence in you. Let me start with what presence actually is at a neurological level. Presence is the state of being fully engaged with the current moment without being hijacked by threat responses. It is what happens when your ventral vagal system remains active even in challenging circumstances. When your prefrontal cortex maintains full functionality. When your attention stays with what is happening rather than fragmenting into worry about what might happen. In this state, you have access to your complete cognitive repertoire. You can think creatively. You can respond flexibly. You can read social cues accurately. You can make decisions that account for complexity rather than collapsing into binary survival choices. This is the state where your best work happens, where your real capabilities become visible, where you show up as the person you actually are rather than the diminished version that anxiety produces. The problem is that pressure reliably destroys presence in most people. The mechanism is straightforward. Pressure signals potential threat to your nervous system. Threat triggers sympathetic activation. Activation restricts blood flow to the prefrontal cortex. Restricted blood flow impairs executive function. Impaired executive function reduces the very capabilities you need most when stakes are high. This is why people choke under pressure. Not because they lack ability, but because the pressure itself degrades their access to their ability. They are trying to perform with a brain that has partially shut down the systems required for performance. The average person accepts this as inevitable. Pressure makes me anxious. Anxiety hurts my performance. Therefore, pressure and performance are enemies. From this frame, the only options are to avoid pressure or to white-knuckle through it using discipline, which, as we established in Chapter 6, is unsustainable and ultimately counterproductive. Elite performers operate from a completely different understanding. They recognize that pressure and presence are not opposites. They are potential partners. The energy that pressure generates is the same energy that presence requires. The difference lies entirely in how that energy is processed and directed. Let me explain what I mean with a model I call the pressure conversion spectrum. When pressure arrives, your nervous system generates activation energy. This energy has to go somewhere. It cannot simply disappear. The question is not whether you will have a response to pressure, but what form that response will take. There are three possibilities, and they exist on a spectrum. On one end is reactivity. This is where most people land. The pressure energy activates the survival brain. Fight, flight, or freeze responses engage. Thinking narrows. Perception distorts. Behavior becomes defensive and automatic rather than creative and chosen. You are not responding to the situation. You are reacting to your nervous system's threat assessment of the situation. In the middle is suppression. This is where disciplined people often land. The pressure energy activates the survival brain, but willpower intervenes. You force yourself to appear calm. You override the impulse to react. You maintain composure through effort. This looks like presence from the outside, but internally, you are burning resources at an unsustainable rate. The pressure has not been converted. It has been contained, and containment always eventually fails. On the other end is presence. This is where the energy itself transforms. The pressure activates your system, but instead of triggering threat responses, it amplifies engagement. Your senses sharpen. Your focus intensifies. Your capabilities expand rather than contract. You are using the same energy that causes most people to fall apart to become more capable than you would be in low-stakes situations. Athletes call this the zone. Performers call it flow. Executives call it executive presence. The name varies, but the phenomenon is identical. Pressure energy is being converted into enhanced functionality rather than degraded functionality. Here is the critical insight. This conversion does not happen through effort. It happens through understanding. Trying harder to be present under pressure is like trying harder to fall asleep. The effort itself prevents the outcome. What creates presence is a shift in how your nervous system interprets the pressure signals. Dr. Ali Akram at Stanford University has conducted groundbreaking research on stress mindset. In her studies, participants who were taught to view stress as enhancing rather than debilitating showed dramatically different physiological responses to identical stressors. Same pressure, different interpretation, completely different biological cascade. The participants with the enhancing mindset showed increased cardiac output, better peripheral blood flow, and maintained cognitive function under stress. The participants with the debilitating mindset showed constricted blood vessels, reduced cognitive function, and elevated cortisol. Their bodies literally responded differently to the same stimulus based purely on how they had been taught to interpret it. This is not positive thinking. This is nervous system programming. Your body responds to your interpretation of events, not just to events themselves. An interpretation can be changed. But here's where most people get stuck. You cannot simply decide to interpret pressure as enhancing and have your nervous system comply. If it were that easy, everyone would do it. The shift requires something more fundamental. It requires changing what pressure means to your survival brain. Currently, your nervous system interprets pressure as threat. It reads high stakes as danger. It treats uncertainty as evidence that something bad might happen. This interpretation triggers protection mode, and protection mode destroys presence. The conversion happens when your nervous system learns to interpret pressure as challenge instead of threat. Challenge and threat feel similar. Both involve activation. Both involve elevated energy, but they produce completely different physiological and cognitive states. Threat says this situation might harm me. I need to protect myself. I should narrow my focus to survival concerns. I should prepare to fight, flee, or freeze. Challenge says this situation demands my engagement. I have resources to meet it. I should expand my focus to opportunity. I should prepare to perform. Researchers at the University of Rochester have measured these distinct responses precisely. Challenge states show increased cardiac efficiency, maintained peripheral blood flow, and elevated testosterone relative to cortisol. Threat states show decreased cardiac efficiency, vasoconstriction, and elevated cortisol relative to testosterone. Same activation level, completely different biological signature, and completely different performance outcomes. The question becomes, how do you shift from threat interpretation to challenge interpretation when pressure arrives? The answer is not cognitive. It is somatic. Your nervous system does not take instructions from your thoughts. It takes instructions from your body. Specifically, from signals of safety or danger that your body is sending at any given moment. This is why the gap I have mentioned throughout this book is so crucial. The moment between stimulus and response, between pressure arriving and your system deciding how to interpret it. In that gap, you can send signals that influence the interpretation. Here is what this looks like in practice. Pressure arrives. Your system begins to activate. In the old pattern, you would immediately start thinking about the pressure, analyzing the stakes, worrying about outcomes. This mental engagement accelerates the threat response because your thoughts are confirming danger to your nervous system. In the new pattern, you pause before engaging mentally. You take one breath where the exhale is longer than the inhale. This single physiological act stimulates the vagus nerve and signals safety to your system. You notice where you feel the activation in your body without judging it or trying to change it. This acceptance signals that the activation is not an emergency requiring override. Then, and only then, you engage with the situation. But now you are engaging from a different state. Your system has received safety cues. It has interpreted the activation as challenge rather than threat. Your prefrontal cortex remains online. Your full capabilities are available. The entire process takes less than 10 seconds. It looks like nothing from the outside, but internally, it is the difference between presence and reactivity. Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School documented what he called the relaxation response decades ago. What we now understand is that this response is not about relaxation in the passive sense. It is about switching which branch of your autonomic nervous system is driving your experience. And that switch can be initiated rapidly with the right cues. Elite performers do this so automatically that they do not even realize they are doing it. They have practiced the conversion so many times that it has become their default response to pressure. But they all started where you were starting, with conscious practice, with intentional gap creation, with deliberate signaling to their nervous systems in high-stakes moments. Here is the most important reframe for understanding this conversion. Pressure is not the enemy of presence. Presence without pressure is just relaxation. It is easy to be present when nothing is at stake. The goal is not to eliminate pressure, but to use it, to let its energy amplify your engagement rather than degrade your function. Every time you face pressure, you face a choice. You can let the default threat interpretation run its course and experience the predictable cascade of narrowing, reactivity, and diminished capacity. Or you can intervene in the gap, shift the interpretation to challenge, and experience the equally predictable cascade of expansion, responsiveness, and enhanced capability. The first few times you try this, it will feel awkward. Your old patterns have deep grooves. Your nervous system has years of threat conditioning to overcome. But every successful conversion creates new neural pathways. Every time you meet pressure with presence instead of reactivity, you make the next conversion slightly easier. Over time, presence under pressure stops being something you manufacture and becomes something you embody. Not because you have eliminated your activation response, but because you have trained your system to interpret activation as fuel rather than alarm. This is the conversion that changes careers, that transforms relationships, that makes you the person others want in the room when things get difficult. Not because you are calm while others panic, but because you have learned to use what makes others panic as the source of your clarity. In the next chapter, we go deeper into what this presence produces. Because presence under pressure is not just about surviving difficult moments. It is about projecting something that others can feel, something that makes you trustworthy, authoritative, and magnetic without needing to perform confidence you do not feel. We call it calm authority, and it is the natural byproduct of everything you have been learning. Chapter 9. The Calm Authority Principle. There is a reason people stop talking when certain individuals enter a room, and it has almost nothing to do with what those individuals say, their titles, or their accomplishments. Research from Princeton University's psychology department found that humans form judgments about trustworthiness, competence, and leadership potential within 100 milliseconds of encountering someone. 100 milliseconds. Before a single word is spoken, before credentials can be evaluated, before any evidence of capability can be presented, something else is being read. That something is nervous system state, and it is being broadcast constantly, whether you realize it or not. You have felt this yourself. Walking into a room and immediately sensing who is anxious, who is confident, who is dangerous, who is safe. You did not need anyone to tell you. You did not analyze body language consciously. You just knew. Something in you read something in them. And now you understand what that something is. Your nervous system was reading their nervous system. Your social engagement circuitry was detecting their regulation state. And that detection shaped everything about how you perceived and responded to them. This chapter is about the other side of that equation. Not how you read others, but how others read you. Because here is the truth that changes everything about social confidence. You do not project authority through performance. You project it through regulation. And once you understand how this works, you will never waste energy on performed confidence again. Let me start with the mechanism. Your autonomic nervous system state is not private. It is constantly being transmitted through microsignals that others detect without conscious awareness. Facial muscle tension, voice frequency and rhythm, breathing patterns, postural organization, eye movement quality, skin coloration changes. These signals are subtle individually, but collectively, they paint a detailed picture of your internal state. Dr. Stephen Porges, whose polyvagal theory we discussed in Chapter 4, calls this neuroception. It is the process by which nervous systems evaluate other nervous systems for safety or danger, and it happens beneath conscious awareness in both directions. You are reading others while they are reading you. Every interaction is an exchange of nervous system information happening in parallel with the exchange of words and ideas. When your nervous system is in a threat state, this is what others detect. Your facial muscles are slightly tenser, particularly around the eyes and jaw. Your voice has less prosodic variation, becoming flatter or more strained. Your breathing is shallower and faster. Your movements are either more rigid or more erratic. Your eye contact is either avoidant or too intense. None of these signals are conscious choices. They are automatic expressions of your autonomic state, and no amount of trying to appear calm will override them, because the detection is also automatic. Others do not consciously notice these signals. They simply feel that something is off. They do not trust you as much. They do not feel safe with you. They are less likely to follow your lead or be influenced by your ideas. When your nervous system is in a regulated ventral vagal state, the transmission changes entirely. Your facial muscles are relaxed and mobile, capable of genuine expression. Your voice has natural variation in tone, pace, and rhythm. Your breathing is deep and regular. Your movements are fluid and purposeful. Your eye contact is comfortable, neither avoiding nor staring. Others detect this state and feel its effects. They relax in your presence. They feel safer. They trust you more. They are more likely to be influenced by what you say, not because you performed confidence, but because your regulated state signaled safety to their nervous systems, which responded by opening rather than protecting. This is the calm authority principle. Authority that comes not from dominance or display, but from the regulation state you embody. It is the most sustainable and authentic form of influence because it does not require you to be someone you are not. It only requires you to be regulated. The average person trying to project confidence focuses on externals. They work on their posture, their handshake, their voice projection, their power poses. These are not useless, but they are surface interventions that fail under pressure because they require conscious maintenance. The moment attention is demanded elsewhere, the moment stakes increase, the performance collapses, and the underlying dysregulation shows through. Elite performers understand that the external signals are downstream of internal state. They do not try to control the signals directly. They regulate their nervous system and let the signals take care of themselves. This is both easier and more effective. Easier because you are managing one variable instead of dozens. More effective because the resulting signals are congruent. Nothing is being performed. Everything matches. And human nervous systems are exquisitely tuned to detect incongruence. A study at MIT's Media Lab measured what they called honest signals in organizational settings. Researchers used wearable sensors to track physiological and behavioral markers during meetings, negotiations, and presentations. They found that they could predict outcomes, who would be influential, who would be persuasive, who would be seen as leadership material, with remarkable accuracy using only these signals. The content of what people said mattered far less than how their nervous systems were operating while they said it. The most influential individuals in the study shared a common pattern. Their physiological markers showed regulation even in high-stakes situations. Their heart rate variability remained high. Their cortisol levels stayed moderate. Their microexpressions matched their words. This regulation was not something they were doing. It was something they were being, and everyone around them could feel it. Now let me show you why this matters so much for high performers dealing with anxiety. Anxiety does not just affect how you feel. It affects how you are perceived. Every time you enter a meeting in an activated state, your nervous system is broadcasting threat signals that others detect. They do not know they are detecting them. They just feel less inclined to trust you, less comfortable with your leadership, less open to your ideas. And you sense their subtle withdrawal, which activates you further, which broadcasts more threat, which creates more withdrawal. The cycle compounds invisibly. You have probably experienced this as certain rooms just feel harder than others. Certain audiences that seem resistant for no apparent reason. Certain interactions that should go well, but inexplicably do not. What you are experiencing is the social cost of nervous system dysregulation. Not a problem with your ideas or your skills. A problem with the state from which you are presenting them. The reverse is equally true. When you enter a situation regulated, you broadcast safety. Others relax. They become more receptive. They attribute your calm to competence. They grant you informal authority simply because your presence makes them feel secure. This is not manipulation. It is biology. Humans have evolved to follow regulated individuals because, for most of our history, regulation signaled accurate threat assessment and sound judgment. Here's where it gets interesting. Your regulation does not just affect how others perceive you. It affects how they feel. And this happens through a process called co-regulation. Dr. James Cohn at the University of Virginia has studied co-regulation extensively. His research shows that when people are in proximity, their nervous systems influence each other. A regulated person in a group tends to downregulate those around them. A dysregulated person tends to upregulate others toward threat response. This happens automatically, beneath awareness, through the same channels of microsignals we have been discussing. This is why certain people are calming to be around while others are exhausting. Their states are contagious. You catch what their nervous system is broadcasting, and they catch what yours is broadcasting. Consider the implications for leadership and influence. When you are regulated, you are not just projecting authority. You are actively regulating others. You are making it easier for them to think clearly, access their capabilities, and perform well. You become someone people want to be around because being around you literally makes them function better. This is the deepest form of leadership, not commanding others to follow, not persuading them with arguments, but creating a nervous system field in which they naturally become more capable. This is what the best leaders do intuitively. They do not just manage people. They regulate them through their presence. Conversely, when you are dysregulated, you are actively spreading dysregulation. Your anxiety makes others anxious. Your threat state triggers their threat states. You become someone people unconsciously avoid because proximity to you degrades their function. No amount of competence can overcome this. You might be right about everything you say and still find that nobody wants to follow your lead. Now let me address the question that is probably forming. How does someone with anxiety become someone who regulates others? It sounds like a catch-22. You need to be regulated to project authority. But your whole issue is that you struggle with regulation. Here is the answer. You do not need to be perfectly regulated. You need to be more regulated than your current baseline. And you need to understand that regulation is a practice, not a destination. Nobody is regulated all the time. The calmest leaders you admire experience activation, anxiety, and dysregulation. The difference is in their recovery. They return to baseline faster. They recognize dysregulation earlier. They have practiced the conversion from pressure to presence enough times that the pathway is well worn. Your goal is not to eliminate anxiety. It is to reduce the time you spend in activated states and increase the speed of your return to regulation. Every percentage point improvement in this ratio changes how others experience you. Even modest shifts produce noticeable results in how much authority you project. Research from the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin found that just 8 weeks of regulation practice produced measurable changes in how others perceive practitioners. Colleagues rated them as more trustworthy, more competent, and more leader-like, not because they had become different people, but because their nervous system baselines had shifted enough to change what they were broadcasting. 8 weeks. That is all it took for the social perception to shift. The internal experience took longer to fully transform. But the external projection, the authority others perceived, changed relatively quickly. Because what others detect is not your lifetime history of anxiety. It is your current state. And current states can be shifted faster than deep patterns. Here is the practical application. Before any high-stakes interaction, take 60 seconds to regulate. Not to calm yourself down through force, but to signal safety to your nervous system through physiology. Extended exhales, grounded posture, relaxed facial muscles, soft gaze. These are not performance techniques. They are state induction techniques. They shift your autonomic balance toward ventral vagal activation. Then enter the interaction from that state. Not performing confidence. Being regulated. Let your nervous system broadcast what it is actually experiencing, which is now closer to safety than threat. Let others detect that state and respond to it. Let their relaxation feed back to you, reinforcing your regulation. Let the positive cycle build. This is sustainable. It does not require you to maintain a mask. It does not deplete your cognitive resources through suppression. It works with your biology instead of against it. And it produces the authority you have been trying to perform but could never maintain. The calm authority you see in great leaders is not a personality trait they were born with. It is a nervous system capacity they developed. It is available to you through the same process, not through becoming someone different, but through training your nervous system to broadcast what you actually want others to detect. In our final chapter, we return to where we began, to the question that brought you here, to the answer that was always waiting underneath the confusion and exhaustion and self-doubt. You were never broken, and now you have the understanding to prove it. Chapter 10. You were never broken. You started this book with a question. Why does my mind feel broken when I am doing everything right? You had done the work, built the habits, pushed through the resistance, achieved things that from the outside looked like success. But inside, something was not matching. The anxiety persisted. The overthinking continued. The exhaustion deepened. And the gap between your external accomplishments and your internal experience made you wonder if something was fundamentally wrong with you. I want you to hear this clearly now, with everything you have learned as context. Nothing was ever wrong with you. Not when the anxiety first appeared. Not during the years you struggled to understand it. Not in the moments you felt most broken, most confused, most certain that others had something figured out that you were missing. There was never a defect. There was never a fundamental flaw. There was only a mismatch. A powerful system designed for one world, operating in a completely different one. Your nervous system is not broken. It is ancient. It evolved over millions of years to solve survival problems that no longer exist in the forms it expects. When it detects threat everywhere, it is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what it was built to do, just in an environment that sends false signals constantly. The anxiety you have been fighting was your system trying to protect you. It was wrong about the danger, but right about its purpose. Your intelligence is not a curse. It is a gift that was never given proper instructions. When your mind loops endlessly, analyzing scenarios that cannot be resolved, it is not failing. It is succeeding at the wrong task. It is applying problem-solving capabilities to uncertainties that do not respond to analysis. The overthinking that exhausts you is your brain's genuine attempt to help, misdirected toward targets it cannot hit. Your emotions are not weaknesses. They are information channels that you were taught to suppress instead of read. When feelings arise that seem inconvenient or irrational, they are not character flaws to be corrected. They are data about your needs, your boundaries, your values, delivered in a format faster than thought. The emotional experiences you have been pushing away contain exactly the guidance you need. Your discipline did not fail you. It was simply pointed in the wrong direction. The willpower you used to push through anxiety was not weakness showing. It was strength misapplied. You were using a tool designed for behavioral challenges against a state-level problem. The exhaustion you felt was not evidence of insufficient effort. It was evidence of effort applied where it could not produce results. Your self-doubt was manufactured. It was not insight into your true inadequacy. It was a byproduct of your nervous system searching for explanations when activation had no clear source. The evidence your mind gathered against you was cherry-picked from an incomplete record, viewed through a filter that anxiety itself created. You were never as incompetent as you felt in your worst moments. That felt sense was a distortion, not a revelation. Everything you experienced made sense, not as pathology, as mechanism, as a system responding to inputs according to its programming. Once you understand the mechanism, you stop being mystified by your own experience. You stop asking what is wrong with me and start asking what is my system responding to and how can I work with it. This is the shift that changes everything. Not fixing, understanding, not becoming someone different. Recognizing who you already are beneath the noise and the struggle and the exhausting internal warfare. Let me tell you what is actually true about you. You are someone whose nervous system learned to prioritize protection, probably for very good reasons that made sense at some point in your history. That learning kept you safe when you needed it. It only becomes problematic when it continues operating at full intensity in circumstances that do not warrant it. This is not damage. It is outdated calibration. And calibration can be updated. You are someone whose intelligence is powerful enough to generate more scenarios than can ever be resolved through thinking. This is a feature, not a bug. The same capability that creates overthinking also creates your ability to plan, to anticipate, to solve genuine problems that others cannot see. The goal is not to diminish this capability, but to direct it appropriately. To use it where it serves you and rest it where it does not. You are someone whose emotional sensitivity registers subtleties that others miss. This is not weakness. It is bandwidth. The same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to overwhelm also makes you capable of deep connection, nuanced understanding, and rich experience. The goal is not to numb this sensitivity, but to develop the regulation capacity to contain it. You are someone who has been trying incredibly hard with tools that were not matched to the task. The effort was real. The intention was genuine. The results were disappointing not because you failed, but because the approach itself was misconceived. You were fighting your own biology instead of working with it. You were treating signals as threats and allies as enemies. Now you know different. You know that anxiety is a nervous system state, not a character flaw, that it can be worked with rather than against. That the gap between activation and elaboration is where freedom lives. That what you feel in your body precedes and shapes what you think in your mind. That addressing the body addresses the thoughts more effectively than fighting thoughts directly ever could. You know that your intelligence requires direction, not suppression. That there are problems and there are uncertainties, and they require completely different responses. That knowing when to analyze and when to allow is a skill more valuable than raw analytical power. That your mind can be your greatest asset once you stop letting it run unsupervised on every input it receives. You know that emotions carry information worth receiving. That suppression creates more problems than it solves. That the fastest way through a feeling is through, not around. That what you resist persists and what you acknowledge can complete its cycle and release. You know that discipline has limits. That willpower depletes. That sustainable performance comes from working with your biology, not overpowering it. That self-compassion is not weakness, but strategic resource management. That being kind to yourself produces better outcomes than being hard on yourself, even by purely functional measures. You know that the spiral from anxiety to self-doubt is manufactured, not discovered. That the evidence against you is gathered by a biased process. That your worst moments are not your truest moments. That how you feel about yourself in an activated state is not a reliable guide to who you actually are. You know that pressure can be converted into presence. That the energy which destabilizes most people can be the very fuel that enhances your performance. That the gap between stimulus and response is where you can choose something different. That regulation is a practice available to anyone willing to engage it. You know that calm authority is broadcast, not performed. That others read your nervous system state whether you want them to or not. That the most sustainable influence comes from being regulated rather than appearing confident. That you can become the kind of presence that others trust and follow simply by training your own system toward regulation. You know all of this now, not as theory, but as understanding. The architecture of your experience has become visible. What was mysterious is now mapped. What felt like personal failing is now recognized as mechanical process. You have the framework to make sense of what you go through and the principles to navigate it differently. But I want to leave you with something beyond knowledge. The reason you picked up this book, the reason you stayed through 10 chapters of dense material, is not that you wanted information. You wanted relief. You wanted someone to explain why you feel the way you feel without making you feel worse about it. You wanted permission to stop fighting yourself. You wanted to know that the struggle you have been in has meaning, that it is not just evidence of your inadequacy, that there is a way through that does not require becoming someone you are not. Here is your permission. You can stop fighting now. Not because the fight is won, but because it was never the right approach. The war inside your head was always unwinnable because you were battling your own protection systems. You were treating your nervous system as an enemy to be conquered when it was an ally sending signals you did not know how to read. The exhaustion you have carried is not your fault. You were given the wrong map. You followed instructions that pointed you in the wrong direction. The self-improvement industry, the professional expectations, the cultural messages about what strength looks like, all of it trained you to approach your inner experience in ways that guaranteed struggle. You did not fail the program. The program was wrong. And now you have something different. Not a new set of techniques to add to your already overflowing toolkit. Not more self-improvement demands to pile onto your already heavy load. Just understanding. Just the clear sight of how your system works and why it does what it does. Just the recognition that what you have been experiencing makes complete sense when you know the mechanisms involved. From this understanding, everything can shift. Not through effort, through allowing. Not through force, through alignment. Not through becoming more than you are. Through finally being what you already were before all the struggle obscured it. Let me tell you what this transformation actually looks like. Not in theory, in the moments of your actual life. It starts small. So small you might miss it if you are not paying attention. You receive an email that would normally send your mind spinning into analysis. But this time, something different happens. You notice the activation beginning. You feel your chest tighten, your thoughts start to race. And instead of being swept away by the current, you recognize it. Oh, this is my nervous system responding. This is activation, not truth. That recognition, that tiny gap between stimulus and reaction, did not exist before. Now it does. And in that gap, you make a different choice. You breathe. You wait. The activation peaks and passes. And you respond to the email from clarity instead of from fear. This happens once, then twice. Then it becomes something you can count on. You walk into a meeting that used to trigger self-doubt. The old voice still whispers that you do not belong, that they will discover you are not as competent as you appear. But now you hear that voice differently. You recognize it as your nervous system running an old pattern, not as revelation about your worth. The voice does not disappear, but it loses its authority. You can feel the doubt and still speak. You can notice the fear and still lead. The feelings no longer dictate your behavior because you finally understand where they come from. Months pass. You realize something has shifted that you cannot quite name. The baseline has moved. You are not fighting yourself as much. The internal noise has quieted, not to silence, but to a manageable hum. You have more energy because you are no longer spending it on an invisible war. You sleep better because your nervous system has learned that nighttime is not threat time. People comment that you seem different, calmer, more present, more yourself. This is not a fantasy. This is the predictable result of understanding replacing confusion, of working with your biology instead of against it, of finally having the map that matches the territory you have been lost in for years. You were always capable of calm. It was just buried under activation. You were always capable of presence. It was just blocked by protection. You were always capable of clarity. It was just clouded by noise. These capacities did not need to be built. They needed to be uncovered. To find, beneath the anxiety and overthinking and self-doubt, the grounded person who was there all along. It is the beginning. The patterns you have lived with will not dissolve overnight. The grooves in your nervous system are deep. You will still catch yourself looping. But now you will recognize what is happening. You will see the mechanism instead of being lost inside it. You will know that the anxiety is a state, not truth. That the feelings are information, not condemnation. And from that recognition, you will have choices you did not have before. Each time you choose differently, the new pathways strengthen. Each time you meet activation with acknowledgement instead of resistance, your system learns. Each time you convert pressure into presence instead of collapse, the conversion becomes more natural. It is practice in the generative sense. The question you started with has been answered. Your mind feels broken when you are doing everything right because you were doing the wrong kind of everything. You were fighting when you needed to understand. You were efforting when you needed to allow. You were trying to fix what was never damaged. There is nothing to fix. There is only a system to understand, a relationship to repair, and a capacity to recover that was never actually lost. You are not broken. You were never broken. You were just never given the map that matches the territory. Now you have it. Use it well.